I watched his months in office with increasing alarm. Probably what put me over the edge was reviewing the number of amicus briefs that the state was putting out. At my count, at the end of March, he had issued 110 amicus briefs, which really seemed to me to be completely inappropriate use of the time of the Attorney General or the Attorney General's staff. Probably the final shooter drop for me was his decision to allow the Division of Elections to turn over voter files to the Department of Justice, when it was clearly something that both violated the state constitution, but in my view also violated federal law.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Bruce Botelho, former Attorney General for the state of Alaska under Republican Governor Wally Hickel and under Democratic Governor Tony Knowles. Bruce also served as Mayor of Juneau from 1988 to 1991 and from 2003 to 2012. His paternal grandparents first moved to Juneau in 1897, and really since his birth here in 1948, Juneau has remained Bruce Botelho's home. Today we discuss his start in the Alaska government, in Governor Jay Hammond's administration, how he saved Governor Wally Hickel from impeachment and thus paved his way to become AG, and finally, how he decided, as a former AG, to testify in multiple hearings against Governor Dunleavy's nominee to be the next Attorney General, Stephen Cox. Stephen Cox was a guest on this podcast on April 30th. Bruce Botelho, welcome to the podcast.
Delight to be here.
Tell us about your early life.
I was born in Juneau. My parents, my father was actually born in Dawson City, at the turn of the last century, that is 1900. My mother came from South Dakota, wanted to get as far away from South Dakota as she could. She was a social worker. That's what brought her to town. My dad at the time was a territorial highway patrolman and was given the assignment to drive a social worker to what was called the Minifield home, about 17 miles north of Juneau. And that led to romance, marriage, and me. My first school year, actually kindergarten, was in Juneau, but then we were transferred to Anchorage, where I initially started at Harborview School, went over to Airport Heights, and then was one of the entering classes of what was then Windler Junior High. We moved back to Juneau in 1961. My dad retired from what had become, in the meantime, the state police. My mother went back to work as a social worker and graduated from high school at Jim Douglas High School.
What class?
Class of 66, which is celebrating, by the way, its 60th. After high school, I spent a year as an exchange student in Germany and then went to Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, where I ultimately got my undergraduate degree. I spent another year in Germany and got the equivalent of a bachelor's in German literature, and then did 2 years of alternative service in Ketchikan before going to law school, again at Willamette University, and then coming back to Alaska in 1976.
And you came back to Juneau?
Yes. So originally slated to go to Anchorage for a position there, but when I checked in immediately completing the bar examination in Juneau, I was told there was an opportunity to take a position here, and I jumped at the chance. And Juneau has been my base of operations since. I worked in the Department of Law in what was then called the Business Regulation and Taxation section. That was considered perhaps a improper title for an administration that wanted to be seen as more business friendly, so it became the commercial section.
This is during the Hammond administration?
Into the Hammond administration, exactly, and then transition to the Sheffield administration. And in December of 1983, I was invited to become Deputy Commissioner of Revenue, which I did for the next 2.5 years. and then dropped out for a year, where I ended up spending time in Mexico and what was in Czechoslovakia.
Did you drop out and go to Mexico and Czechoslovakia because you were Deputy Commissioner of Revenue during a scandalous period in the Sheffield administration?
The long and short of it is that I made a contribution to Steve Cooper's campaign for governor at a point where I didn't think that
anyone was watching.
Not so much that, but doubted that Sheffield was going to run again. And I was basically told that I would be forgiven if I would match that contribution to the Sheffield campaign. And I, stubbornly or not, said no, and I left. And that created the opportunity to reflect on where my life was going to go.
So what'd you do in Mexico and Czechoslovakia?
One of my passions in life then, and it continues today, is folk dance. And so did a bit of that. I also love languages. And so these were opportunities to learn language and learn a culture and get to meet people doing what they love as well, much of the dancing. And out of that experience, actually, I met my wife, who was born and raised in Mexico City, but now is a thorough Alaskan, that's over. And I returned then during the Cooper administration to...
Hey, I want to stop right there. So you married your wife from when you were in Mexico. You met her in Mexico.
Yeah, we married here and then back in Mexico again.
But Botelho is a Portuguese name.
It is.
I before we got started, I told you that I was reading about, is it your grandfather,
yes,
Manuel Botelho, who came from
the Azores.
Yes. So did you have a relationship with the Portuguese side of your family when you were growing up, or?
Not at all. I mean, to put it in perspective, I mean, I've had a lifelong interest in Portugal because of that connection. But my grandfather died in 1943. My father actually knew little about his background. I probably know a lot more about it than he did. I've done a lot of research, and I've had a chance to visit São Jorge, which is the island he was born on. And I make it a point.
Because your grandfather was like part of the gold. I mean, he came out from gold.
Yes, he started the first record of him was being what was described as a hotel man in terms of when he shows up in the United States, and that is in Butte, Montana. And that is where he first encountered my grandmother, though they ended up getting married in Seattle. And there's a story that is lost to time. But in 1897, they moved to Juneau. And then with all the news about the gold rush, they decided to move to Dawson, which they did in 1899. They ran both a clothing store and a restaurant at some points in Dawson, but ultimately ended up acquiring mining lease claims on Quartz Creek off the Klondike River, and tried to work that for several years. They ended up in litigation with Guggenheim interests. They litigated, they lost, and by 1913, they made the decision to move on. And my grandfather and uncle went on to the gold fields in the Nana, and my grandmother and father made their way to Juneau in 1913. That's been the family home.
Got it.
Since.
So just bouncing forward. So you met your wife when you were in Mexico.
Yes.
Did she go with you to Czechoslovakia?
Well, she's been with me to Czechoslovakia.
But at that time, because you...
No. No, we had not met that year.
Oh, got it. Okay, so
I returned to Mexico again the following year.
Oh.
And began my courtship.
Well, I wanted to ask about, because you were in, it's no longer Czechoslovakia, so you were there.
The last 2 years of 2.5 years of Czechoslovakia. Yeah.
Correct. So what was that like?
Well, there are many aspects to it. Again, a lot of personal contacts. I was able to stay in a home of a fairly revered musicologist, and through that made contact with a lot of particularly dancers and musicians. But one of the things that was noticeable in particular, I was warned right to begin with that if I tried to listen to any Western radio, whether it was coming from Germany or Radio Free Europe, that I needed to do it in the farthest reaches of the home, and preferably not to do it at all because things were monitored. I was cautioned that my letters, mail, whatever was outgoing or incoming, would be read. And that proved after the Velvet Revolution to have been the case. And it explained why it would take an additional week for mail in either direction. People would be very cautious in how they communicated to each other. One of the jokes that was quite prevalent is that we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And the other thing that I particularly remember in terms of healthcare was, again, universal healthcare, but in terms of access to a doctor and whether you were going to get good treatment or not, really depended on you bringing, quote, gifts, usually in the form of a bottle of Schwitz or some other beverage or some other gift of value. That's the way you got your medical attention, as it were.
Did you speak Czech?
I learned a fair bit. I still communicate pretty basically. And one of the things that, because I'm always talking politics, I mean, I'm probably a little more fluent in that regard than in other areas. But yeah, I do speak some Czech.
And you speak Spanish?
I do.
And your wife is Mexican?
Yes.
Yeah. And do you speak Portuguese?
I do some. I passed, there's a language requirement for citizenship, and I've passed that test. And
do you speak any other languages?
German, of course.
German.
Yeah.
So German, Czech, Portuguese, and Spanish?
Yeah. And I've taken courses in French and Russian as well.
Well, I guess when you came back, Steve Cooper had been elected.
Yes.
So bygones be bygones. Like there was no issue with having made the donation and while you were still...
No, and I would say, in fact, that probably the fact that I had been an early supporter of Steve's gave me entree back into the Department of Law. And so I, at that point, assumed responsibility for the oil and gas section of the department. And that's what I ended up doing for, I would say, until roughly 1992, when I became Deputy Attorney General under Charlie Cole. I should say I also had a little political foray or two in the meantime. I ran for and was elected to the Juneau Assembly in 1983 for a 3-year term. And I had also been elected as Mayor of Juneau in 1988, concurrent with my time.
So I just have to say that you're not the first Juneau mayor to be on the podcast, and I'm bringing it up because it's all during this period, but Fran Ulmer's been on the podcast.
Oh, yeah. Fran and I were elected at the same time in 1983.
Okay. People have always made a joke about your long history of service to the state, and then they always say as an afterthought, and in his free time, he was mayor of Juneau, and I guess, is there any truth to that? Was being on the assembly and being mayor just like an extracurricular activity?
The answer is more than an extracurricular activity. It took a lot of time. And I have to say that my wife was very tolerant in terms of the time that I was putting in for both. Fortunately, she has a similar personality in terms of just full engagement with the things that she undertakes. And so...
Was it difficult to convince her to move to Alaska?
Yes. I would say after she got here, it was more difficult. once she got to Juneau, after we married and suffering through the very short days, the darkness really had a profound effect on her. And part of our agreement was to give her some time to find son, which meant either going back to Mexico or to join her best friend from Mexico who was living at the time in Hawaii. And I think another initial difficulty for her, which is a difficulty for anyone coming into a new culture, is understanding the language. She understood me fine, but she had difficulty understanding others. Well, she, of course, in the meantime, is a utterly perfect English speaker. But those were the early, I would say, tribulations for her.
Yeah, and like bouncing all the way forward to now, but I just had my own little epiphany because you had participated in one of the hearings that we held in House Judiciary last year about the Trump administration's treatment of immigrants.
Yes.
And I'm just now making the connection that it's like very personal.
Yeah, it is in many ways, partly as a result of my experiences abroad, our own working through the green card and then ultimately naturalization for my wife. But I also reflect even my father did not become a U.S. citizen until I was 4 years old. So, I mean, I have that also as I look.
Because he was born in Dawson City?
Yes.
Okay. Like Canada.
Yes. And he had thought at some point in his teenage years that my parents, or my grandfather specifically, had actually gotten naturalized, but he never was able to find records of proof. This issue came up in the early 50s when he was applying for a radio license as part of his work with the Highway Patrol. And we're dealing with the Red Scare. And so the ability to prove citizenship, the fact that he couldn't establish it, led to his initial denial of the license and then the decision then to apply.
Going back to being elected to the Juneau City Council in 83.
Juneau Assembly.
Juneau Assembly.
Yes.
Yeah. Because you are unified like Anchorage.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, we're the first, just to be clear, first unified government in the state, of which we're very proud.
What were the particular issues or challenges in your early years? Because when did you become mayor the first time?
1988.
88. What was an issue that you had as mayor in 88?
Well, I can think of several, but a couple that particularly come to mind. We had a member of city government who was lesbian and was concerned about being protected under municipal code. And she and a group of other women petitioned the city assembly to enlarge our prohibition on discrimination to include sexual orientation. And it set off an immediate explosion in the community. Religious right came out very forcefully against it. We had a couple of assembly members who were particularly upset about it as well. And during the course of at least 2 hearings testifying, we had hundreds of people showing up. The second hearing, I actually asked proponents and opponents to designate 2 or 3 people to speak and give them additional minutes, 10 minutes, and then encourage everyone else to basically, if they could, simply say, I agree or I disagree. And cautioning everyone to respect that it's a frightening experience for people to testify, that we can't allow for cheers or boos, and simply be proud that people are willing to contribute to the dialogue. And people were uniformly accepting of the caution, which I appreciated. But we were still at loggerheads and kept on searching for a compromise and ultimately found one that satisfied the proponents and the opposition as well, which did not use the word sexual orientation and simply said that all decisions for the hiring, retention, or promotion of a city employee would be based solely on merit. And that formulation worked. I consider that to be one of the achievements.
And you were working at Department of Revenue?
No, at that point, I was in the Department of Law.
Okay. So you became Deputy Attorney General in 1992.
Yes.
And I know Charlie Cole was the Attorney General during the mental health settlement. But was that?
Well, he was not
sorry.
Attorney General during the settlement that was actually reached. He devoted a great deal of his time trying to reach an agreement. There were basically four separate plaintiffs groups. He reached a settlement with two, but not with the other. And that settlement was rejected overall. I took another stab at it as Attorney General. Initially, while still deputy, but really coming to fruition in Hickel's last year.
What year did you become Attorney General?
I became Attorney General in, officially in January of '94, so the last year of Hickel's term. Charlie had actually resigned shortly before, and in no small part over the mental health issue, trust issue in terms of conflict that he had with Harry Noah, who was the Commissioner of Natural Resources, who had a different view about how this should go forward. And the then Chief of Staff, Pat Ryan, sided with Harry rather than Charlie. And Charlie saw that as indication that he should go.
Were you friends with Charlie?
Yes. I have to say, I was frustrated with his management style from fairly early on, but he's a great attorney. And what led me to admire him most was a decision that was trying to be foisted upon him by Edgar Paul Boyko and with support from the governor to terminate a lot of the senior attorneys in the department as not being sufficiently of the right mind, to put it that way, that needed to be bumped off. There was a specific list developed. There were probably 30 names on it. I was one of them. And Edgar Paul wrote a letter to the governor explaining how the governor should approach this, and that is to encourage Charlie to go through with the list if he wasn't prepared to do that, to send him on an assignment perhaps to Japan to represent the state, or for him to resign temporarily and let him, that is Boyko, make the cuts, and then Charlie can come back after the house was clean. And Charlie drew the line. He says, if I'm your attorney general, I make these decisions. I don't want anybody interfering. We're not going to do this. And the governor clearly followed that direction.
Well, it's interesting that you were on the list and then you replaced Charlie.
Yes. There were ideological issues with me fairly early on, but I had a couple instances because I was the ethics attorney for the state at the time. And there was one particular issue, Yukon Pacific, in which a local citizen here had challenged the governor whether he had a conflict of interest. And it led to the ethics board hiring an outside counsel to examine, and she conferred with me a couple of times on terms of the interpretation of the Ethics Act, and in the course of that, ultimately shared that she was going to be compelled to actually file against the governor, and based on the lack of cooperation she was getting from Hickel's private attorney, I shared this with the governor's then chief of staff, and he didn't do anything about it. And she gave me another warning maybe a week later that it was about to drop. And I provided the warning again, and I was told just to stay out of it. And then I was actually in a deposition in the Valley here in Juneau, and I got this urgent call from the governor's office to drop whatever I was doing. I get summoned immediately into the governor's office. There are all these people, chief of staff, a couple other cabinet officers, and other staff to the governor. They're all looking glum. There's one seat which is directly in front of the governor's desk, and the governor is shouting at somebody on the phone. And the governor's so angry, he starts kicking the desk. That's how kinetic he was in terms of expressing his frustration. And I lean over to the person who was the chief staff person in the department. What's going on? And he hands me the daily clip. At that point, the internet was not part of the course. You got your summary of all news in the state by fax. And this fax had the headline from the Anchorage Daily News that the ethics prosecutor had filed charges against the governor. And Mitch Abood, one of the governor's best loyalists in the legislature, was saying this could lead to impeachment. And I read the article, and when the governor got off the phone, and he says, well, does anybody have a solution to this? And I said, Governor, I think there's a great opportunity. And I said, but it's first, are you prepared to give up your shares in Yukon Pacific, put in a blind trust? He says, of course, but my attorney tells me I don't need to. I said, I'm just asking you, Governor, are you prepared to do that? If your answer is yes, then I think this can be solved before Christmas. I think what you need to do is say this is the first time you've been officially notified that there's an ethics problem, that you are prepared to make this divestment, and you should ask your attorney to work out an agreement. And in order to restore any lack of confidence in the government, this needs to be dealt with quickly, and you're going to summon the ethics board together to review the outcome as quickly as they can. Words to that effect. The upshot was the governor said, do it. And we left the office. Charlie, who was in Fairbanks at the time, got a call and shared with me that whatever I'd done, the governor had said to him that he was glad that there was at least one person in the department who believed in him. And the long and short is negotiated agreement. Actually, that attorney kept on fighting the resolution. And so the governor actually fired him and hired Hal Fortin. And by midnight that night, I was over at the mansion having the governor sign a document that I notarized, and he had a good Christmas. Long story, but that was my litmus test, I would say, in terms of gaining some
Because I think people love to talk about Bruce Botelho, who served as Attorney General under a Republican, although he was AIP then, correct?
Yeah, he started out that way.
Yeah.
He returned to
Republican.
He was Republican by the time.
You got it.
Yeah.
And then, and a Democrat. But I assume you were always a Democrat.
Yes.
So I guess this explains why Wally Hickel would have you as Attorney General for the last year, because you saved him from impeachment.
Yeah, I would say there were other examples as well, which proved to me that he had confidence in me. I mean, he trusted me. There was an abortion issue where the chief of staff really wanted to develop a very, what I thought was unconstitutional regime that would be stricken by the courts. And I cautioned that the governor should go incrementally, take a step that I thought would pass legal muster. And if that worked, he could perhaps explore the next step. Well, he took my advice, and it was litigated, and he prevailed.
In terms of limiting abortion.
Yes, but not boring abortion.
Right.
It's an example where your personal beliefs get set aside to provide the best legal advice you can to your principal, in which case this was the governor. But I didn't feel badly about it, because I think I couldn't say where the other outcome would have ended up, though my own advice was that that move, had he taken it, would have been unconstitutional.
Well, going back to the ethics violation.
Sure.
I mean, you were warning the chief of staff, and the chief of staff wasn't telling him. I mean, because, you said, this is what you're going to do. You're going to say that you just now found out about this. But
it was the governor's personal attorney who was resisting.
Got it. Okay. The governor's personal attorney was resisting in
thinking that there's a need for
that it was this was a big deal.
And the problem with the chief of staff was not thinking that I was meddling and sharing the information of what I was hearing from the outside attorney, that the ethics
was a big deal.
And because he was getting word from the private attorney that everything was under control.
Got it.
It was not under control.
Okay. Gotcha. And then Tony Knowles got elected and kept you on.
Yes.
How unusual is that?
It hasn't happened before. It hasn't happened since.
The big issue, I'm assuming, as Attorney General, was the battle over subsistence during the Knowles administration?
Well, there are 2 or 3 major battles. Yeah, subsistence. I would say, more broadly speaking, the role of tribes in Alaska. The ARCO-BP merger was a major issue as well. But clearly subsistence, if there was any one theme that covered all 8 years, it was subsistence.
And the reason why I was told to bring it up is because the few folks who were here in the 90s, who are still in the building, think that people who had no relationship with that period of time don't understand how intense and ugly the debate was around the issue.
Well, it was ugly, in many respects, very racist. Some of that has not changed. I think everything leads back to a decision by the Alaska Supreme Court in 1989. In 86, the legislature had passed, in essence, a rural preference. That was what was struck down in 89. And after that, the efforts were to figure out some way on the state side to make sure that there would continue to be unitary management. I would say in the Native community, overall, a trepidation of allowing the state to manage, because the biases were very clearly, I would say, in favor of urban hunters and fishers, the rubric of the day was, we don't want apartheid by zip code. And so Charlie tried to take that on with the governor in a couple special sessions, but one which did not really seem all that propitious. My last year, I traveled in various rural parts of Alaska trying to chat up what I thought might be a formulation that would work, which would be a combination of an amendment to ANILCA, an amendment to the Alaska Constitution, and some regulatory changes that would allow for that preference. And it ended up being kind of the formulation or a template, I guess, for trying to go forward over the next several years. We'd make it in one house, but not the other. I think our final real efforts may have been in 2000 or 2001, where we needed 3 votes in the Senate. The House had already passed. Or we actually needed 2 out of 3, and tried to negotiate with these 3 proved extraordinarily difficult and ultimately impossible. And one simply kept on upping the price for his support to the point that it was unreasonable. The other 2, I think, ultimately just decided that they weren't going to go there, and it collapsed. We were going to take another run at it in September 2001, and we had gathered in Anchorage. Tom Stewart was going to end up chairing the effort. It was going to be his chief of staff, as it were. And as we gathered that morning, we got news that there had been a plane crash in New York City. And then we got the word there had been a second in the Pentagon. And once 9/11 happened, everything in government shut down, or I would say the agenda just completely changed. That day, in Anchorage, in fact, there was a fear that there was at least a JAL jet heading to Anchorage. Was intended to take it out, and efforts to communicate with the jet and proven impossible, which of course heightened the alarm, and so downtown Anchorage was evacuated. And the adjutant general and I were in the Atwood building in the governor's office at the time, and we decided, we didn't have time to get anywhere anyway, so we just stay. And as it turned out, there had just been a radio malfunction, landed, but all jets that were coming to Alaska were pretty much diverted to Whitehorse. And it took us, I think, another 2.5 days to leave Anchorage because the airspace was completely shut down for a couple, and the governor got special dispensation to take the King Air and 2 or 3 of us to fly back to Juneau. But with that event, the entire agenda intended for the last year changed, and it became almost exclusively focused on homeland security related issues. Every other initiative pretty much went by the by.
That's interesting. And when did you become mayor of Juneau again?
In October of 2003.
Okay. So after you were done being attorney general for Knowles?
Yes. I had my last day in office, I think it was the 4th or 5th of December of 2002, and I played for a better part of a year.
My understanding is that your second run as mayor was dominated by moving the capital.
Well, it was the intent to have a new Capitol built on Telephone Hill, which has long-term been and ambition of the city. I'd been involved in the acquisition in 1984. See that as a site, but it had been identified much earlier. Senator Bill Woodray had actually in the 70s conceptualized Capitol building there as well. I had led the effort to propose a nationwide competition, a design competition, and developed a panel of leading Alaska architects primarily to be the jurors, and did a lot of outreach as well about the role of a capital and in terms of being basically the temple of democracy. And actually there's a person who had written a book basically summarizing the history of state capitals, and who was brought to Juneau as well to, again, help provide the philosophical landscape for such a construction. We had at least 150 proposals, which were winnowed down, I think, initially to maybe 12, and then 4. And with each level, there was some amount of money made available for that work. And ultimately, the final 4 coming to Juneau, presenting, and the selection. The selection was done by an architect by the name of Pritzker from Chicago. Been at one point named the leading architect in the country. His vision, unfortunately, was one that was too extreme for people.
Like too modern.
Too modern, exactly. And too modern, especially for one person, and that was Frank Murkowski. And we needed, up to that point, we had, had the sense that the governor was supportive. Jim Clark was his chief of staff. Jim himself been one of the most sterling and strong advocates for Juneau as the capital. But after the governor saw both the 4 designs, but the specific one that had been selected, he basically withdrew all support for the effort.
But he had been supportive up until he saw the design?
In theory, yes.
Did you like the design?
I thought it had a lot of interesting features. I guess I would describe myself as someone who would have appreciated something a little more traditional. I like columns. But I also felt a need to defer to the people, the architects who actually reviewed the project and saw this as being, a message in terms of a building that we would expect to last for at least 100 years, and how it made use of the topography as well. So I would have supported anything out of it. That's an outcome.
It's interesting because I never stepped foot in this building until I was elected. And I think, in some ways, pretty emotional walking down the halls and just being in the Capitol. I mean, it's different. You grew up in Juneau. It wasn't until I was talking to other legislators where one said, our Capitol building sucks because we don't have a dome. There's nothing beautiful about it. It's an old bank, and I so I'm just saying, my first experience walking into the building for the first time was I loved it. I loved the Capitol. I didn't really notice that we didn't have a dome and we didn't have the features of other state capitals of the extremely beautiful building and something big and grand.
Yeah. No, I think it is a beautiful building. I think internally, I think the difficulty is the lack of space. And then the chambers are too small. The galleries are too small. The meeting rooms, committee rooms are too small. We saw one of the problems in terms of the Scottish Rite Temple and providing space for visitors to be able to do work. But until then, that was I think, a major gap, and all pressing towards the sense that we needed to look at a different building. And I will say that part of efforts, quite apart from that one, to build on Telephone Hill, also looking at how one could remodel and build on top of the garage here in the back, build up and expand the chambers of both the House and the Senate, provide the committee spaces, and also be able to consolidate some of the governmental functions of the legislature that are of necessity farmed out of the building. When I was a boy, which is a long time ago, the legislature met here, but Senate Finance was trial court. The law library was right next to it. The museum, as I recall, was on the second floor. And Ed Kaiton was the curator of that museum, which was exciting. Post office was on the first floor. And there was a blind vendor on the ground floor where you can, buy candy and other sundries. And a screen between the first and ground floor, because kids like us like to fly paper airplanes from as high up as we could get. And so what has happened in terms of just the renovations to capture the sense of the 1930s when this building was first taken, it's been, I think, a wonderful outcome. The carpeting was not like this
When you were little.
Yeah.
Well, I just learned a couple of days ago that the carpet that we have out here is from the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah, during the Sheffield administration.
Exactly. Yeah.
I noticed you're wearing your Juneau Independent vest. Can you talk a little bit about the Juneau Independent?
There were 3 or 4 of us who were becoming frustrated with what seemed to be a corporate decision to withdraw support for the editorial staff at the Juneau Empire, and shared that concern with Mark Sabatini, who was the editor at the Empire at the time, who only confirmed our fears, which was this push to, quote, economize. I'm going to sell as much advertising as we can, but we're going to cut short the local coverage. And there were opportunities, we thought, perhaps to be able to even buy the paper, or it got to the point where, in talking with Mark, who had run his own newspaper in Svalbard, Norway, an online publication, to talk about trying to put something together here in Juneau. And that led to our agreement to try and provide some financing to let it launch. And we launched on the 27th of June last year. And one of the interesting things, Mark had developed such a loyal following within his remaining staff that they all decided to come and join. Mark gets out a daily, virtually every day of the week. And we're growing. The challenge is that we've made a commitment that we do not want to paywall. And so we rely on people who are willing to donate, and we're also beginning now to look at grants to be able to continue and actually be able to grow the paper. It's got roughly 2,000 daily readers that we know of, subscribers, I should say. And part of our motivation, frankly, for launching it is what we saw as the importance of making sure there was local coverage of the legislature, that a capital city had a duty to make sure its own citizens were informed of the center of power.
I'm grateful for for your work on that. I guess to end with, you were in House Judiciary on Monday. You testified against Stephen Cox, the designee to be the next Attorney General. He's currently the acting Attorney General. And you said it in your testimony that it's not an easy thing for you to do as a former Attorney General. And I guess, can you just briefly talk about your decision to testify against the nominee?
I watched his months in office with increasing alarm, triggered, I think, initially by an article that appeared in the Washington Post that I took as basically a criticism of the competence of state courts to deal with complicated matters. And what I found offensive is having the chief legal officer of the state, which is the largest law firm appearing before the courts of the state, to be expressing that kind of view. I was troubled by efforts he made in the press to attack Alaska Airlines, claiming that they were somehow inhibiting law enforcement and promoting crime. His efforts to quash two programs, each in local utilities where people round up pennies that are then directed to local charities. And then his attack on the Anchorage School Board. Those troubled me. Probably what put me over the edge was reviewing both the number of amicus briefs that the state was putting out. At my count, at the end of March, he had issued 110 amicus briefs, which really reflects a stamp of approval, supposedly in the name of the state of Alaska, on a wide range of ideological topics that, in my view, most Alaskans wouldn't agree with if they knew about it, and which, in any event, seemed to me to be completely inappropriate use of the time of the Attorney General or the Attorney General's staff. I mean, the topics included opposing birthright, citizenship, supporting the president's decision to try and remove a member of the board of the Fed, the idea that nursing homes should have the right to require arbitration in any disputes with patients or their families, despite the fact that there is a federal Medicaid rule that expressly bars that. Some inconsistencies, several deal with the Second Amendment. So attacking, on the one hand, the Bureau of Tobacco Firearms as having been intrusive regulation that was intrusive on the rights of states, and then almost at the same time filing separate briefs against the state of New Jersey and the state of Hawaii for their exercise of restrictions that they wanted to impose in their states, that just unseemly for us to be challenging a sister state and its particular schemes, and filing in cases that were not necessarily directly in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, but in courts around the country, not even in the Ninth Circuit, which is the circuit that Alaska finds itself in. So all of those things, I think, raised the alarm. Probably the final shooter drop for me was his decision to allow the Division of Elections to turn over voter files to the Department of Justice, when it was clearly something that both violated the state constitution, but in my view also violated federal law, a conclusion which the 6 courts to have considered the issue and ruled on them have all come to the same conclusion.
Well, Bruce Botelho, thank you so much for being on the show today. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you expected me to?
I had no expectations, so you're safe.
Good. Well, it was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@nakedlight.gov or call 907-465-4940.